Right, our text today is the work by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which moves us into a different genre of writing, namely the novella, and also a different period of writing, because this is written in 1886. We were in the Romantic era up till now. I think we left off with Coleridge. 1798 was the time when he wrote The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. What we are looking at today is something of, as I say, the form is a novella, a short novel. But in terms of the mood and the atmosphere and the type of literature, it probably qualifies as gothic horror. And Gothic horror does not begin in the late Victorian period in which this is written. It probably originates in the late 18th century. And the most famous version of that is probably Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, which I've put on the course in years past, but it's a couple of hundred pages long. And it seems to me a little bit too long to be done on this course as just one book in a long series of other books, just a little bit too demanding. And so for the first time I'm going to try Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because it deals with the same sorts of themes and ideas, but it's 50 pages or thereabouts. So it's a short version of the same sorts of themes, which are of real importance and interest to me, and they introduce themes and interests that are very common in the 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, which is to some degree the problem posed by the Enlightenment about human nature. We first saw it with Jonathan Swift in his Modest Proposal, and what Swift was responding to, I said, and I think tried to make the case. He was saying that the way in which the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, was looking at human nature was as commodities, and they were losing a sense of the importance of and the sanctity of life, and they were doing so perversely along religious lines, even so, ignoring the charitable demands of Scripture actually towards one's fellow neighbor. So if you're Protestant, it justified ignoring the plight of the Catholics in your midst for religious reasons. So it's a sort of Phariseeism. Phariseeism is not a new thing amongst the religious. It's as old as humanity, the appearance of being religious and righteous when in fact one is not acting in anything like that way. What is new, however, is the idea of this being undertaken by the scientific community and being done in the name of humanity, furthermore, and under the guise even of human rights. That is something that Swift introduces in A Modest Proposal, and it seems to me that problem of human nature, when the biblical view of what human nature is discarded, which is what the Enlightenment does. It turns resolutely against the Christian inheritance of how one treats one's fellow human beings, irrespective of whether they're Christian, not Christian, or otherwise. That inheritance being lost, something then replaces it, and what replaces it is human reasoning. And human reasoning is very easily amenable to rationalizing quite horrific things in the name of religion. That's how Swift presented it. Or in the name of nationalism, which is the way it was also presented. Remember, Swift is an Anglican clergyman, and he's writing about the problem of Irish Roman Catholics, and they're a political threat as well as a religious threat, all of those things. But it begins a problem of human nature is there in Gothic fiction. And the problem of the Enlightenment and its reductionist view of what life is, namely a biological or a material object, a thing, results in this Gothic horror scenario. And as I say, Frankenstein is probably the finest illustration of it. Now, the setting for these tales is often in Gothic horror, the medieval period. And the protagonists are often priests or nuns, and there are scandalous crimes often taking place, being hidden in monasteries or in nunneries, murders often transpiring, etc. Mary Shelley pulls that early obsession in the Gothic with horrible crimes being done by religious figures and introduces something which makes it much more interesting and becomes more of a dominant theme as the literature progresses, namely the connection of the mysterious actions of the scientists in their attempt to cure the problems of human nature. Right? You can see that in Swift as well, right? Because he's proposing a way of solving all the problems. I'm making a modest proposal, which if you take it up, it will solve the problem of poverty, it will solve the problem of begging, it will solve the political problems on our doorstep, it will solve the religious threat to Protestantism being placed, it will solve the problem of mothers neglecting their children, it will solve the problem of theft, it will solve the problem of begging and not working for a living. It will make landowners care for the people working on their estates. It will solve the often neglect of children that fathers have. It will give them, to use the phrase in our day, skin in the game. They'll have something, they'll be able to profit from it. And so it reduces everything to the motivation of selfishness. And when Swift does that, he is explicitly trying to expose how underneath scientific progress, human vanity and selfishness still is there. It doesn't go away, right? So that's why we went there. Here, or let me go to Frankenstein. Frankenstein, we didn't read it, so a short summary. Victor Frankenstein is not the monster in that book, Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein is a scientist. And he is a progressive. He wants to use science to advance the human good. He wants to take control of human nature and do good things by it. And when we first meet him, we meet him up actually in the far reaches of the North Pole, where he's encountering another man who is also a benefactor of humanity, an explorer by the name of Walton, who's trying to circumnavigate the globe but through the Northwest Passage. He's going up there and they're stuck in the ice, and then he meets this man who's on a raft, and then he tells him his tale. And the man who he finds on the raft is Victor Frankenstein, who was pursuing his own creation, which is the Frankenstein monster. You know what Frankenstein monster is, but he's huge. And he's composed of body parts. And he's a monstrosity. And unlike the film versions of it, he's highly intelligent as well. So he's a Superman of sorts. And Shelley is depicting there how human intentions are undermined by human depravity. And the ambitions for good often take place in secret, in the dark. And then when they are finally hatched and they become visible to the world, they are monstrous, and the circumstances of the activities of the scientists when they finally come to light are so horrific that everyone is horrified, including the original scientist, but it can no longer be contained. And then the consequences are awful. Now, when I set this novel on the course, I didn't think that it would have contemporary application. But the coronavirus in China right now may be that sort of thing. If it is actually, as is sometimes reported to be, if it was actually the result of an attempt to do experiments on viruses, worrying about genetic warfare and so forth, so experimenting with viruses, and then it's somehow released, whether intentionally or inadvertently. Most people would say it's inadvertently, but it's got out now. And how do we contain the problem? So that just seems a rather interesting and horrific illustration of the relevance of these sorts of things. But there are better versions of it, and the better version is the version that has been undertaken by, I'm going to pull this whiteboard over here for a second. That's not going to do. Oh, okay. So there's Mr. Hyde down there. Something called a movement which I'm going to call Transhumanism. Transhumanism. Now, transhumanism is the attempt to perfect human nature, but by means of technology, by means of science. And those who have been historically most involved in this project are Christians. And the reason they have is because they have regarded science as a means of restoring the ruins wrought by sin. So diseases, illnesses, infirmities, the blight of famine and so forth, we can use our God-given intelligence to explore the nature of the world that God has given us and to seek to undo some of the consequences of the fall. We can't get rid of the problem per se, but we can ameliorate the badness. That has been from the modern scientific era onwards to the late 17th century, technology and science were used to solve problems like that. But they were initially used to solve problems in the world outside of human beings. Come the 19th century, the gaze turns from the world outside of humanity to humanity itself. So now, what began as an attempt to ameliorate the conditions of human nature change into an attempt to change and perfect human nature itself. And at that point, the scientists are, as it were, playing God. But many regard it not, and that charge of playing God never comes without any sense of censure. There's a sense that you're doing something terribly wrong by doing this. But for the scientists, the intention is not to do a bad thing. I mean, there are bad scientists, I guess. They're the sort that you meet in James Bond films and so forth, nasty people trying to take over the world, and there are such people. But in general, the portrait in literature is not of such people, it's of people that mean good, and the intentions are good. And that is the very thing that makes it so terrifying. If these were just bad individuals, then it wouldn't hit so close to home. These are people like us who intend well and maybe are more capable than we are, and even maybe morally superior individuals. And yet, they create untold problems. Now, I say this is a problem in literature, or rather something that's discussed in literature repeatedly. So I'm just teaching a course on C.S. Lewis right now, and it's certainly a part of his fiction, very much so, particularly in his science fiction trilogy. But even in the Narnia Chronicles, he's talking about modern education and the use of science in ways that empower the scientists but dehumanize the people. And it's a theme of Tolkien's corpus of writing as well. If you look at The Lord of the Rings and what Saruman does Anyone a Lord of the Rings fan here? Some, okay. He used to love the trees, but now he has a mind of metal, and he burns the trees, and with the power of that, he forges new creatures, a master race which he's going to dominate and rule over the world. And so the motivation for all this is power. But now it's power not just power over nature, but power over human nature. So the problem gets exacerbated. The problem that Swift first spoke about now becomes a far more insidious project. And that project, without attributing too much to this individual, there is a professor at Oxford University right now by the name of Julian Savulescu, who is a leading proponent of the field of human enhancement. And I mention his name because he's one of the clearest expositors of this. So it's the attempt to use human knowledge to advance human nature. And there are various ways of doing this project, by the way. So you can do it cybernetically. So you can use it by attaching limbs, so like a cyborg. You can do it chemically, as in the mental health industry. So people who suffer from various ailments, if you take a chemical, it will help you contain some of the trauma of mental illness. You can see it in other forms as well, even the idea of gene splicing and so forth, right? So you can do it in utero even. Now all of these things are being discussed very prominently in the mid-20th century as literary exploration of what the scientists are actually already doing. And in general, the scientists don't come off very well. The writers are very concerned with this. But the reason I mentioned Savulescu is because he doesn't only want to improve the human intellect, and he doesn't only want to improve our physical strength, because you can take chemicals to do that. I mean, you can take steroids, for instance. He also thinks and wants to improve our moral nature. And that's where I think it's interesting. And he thinks that brain science is providing some of the data necessary to shape a better human race. And I'm not going to go on about that per se. I just want to demonstrate that what I'm talking about here as a 19th century horror novel remains relevant. And so when discussing that, I think we need to bear that in mind. Now, when it was first produced, it was produced in what they called a shilling shocker. You buy it for a shilling. So it was a very popular genre of writing at the time. So these small little novellas, you buy for a shilling. I mean, you can see it's a short little book. You buy it for a shilling, called a shilling shock or a penny dreadful. And so there was a great interest in horror fiction in the 19th century. You might have read Edgar Allan Poe. Anyone a Poe fan? So that sort of thing. But it's also often goes with science fiction. Science fiction often gives us horror scenarios, like the movie Alien or something like that. But it's even in the Star Wars trilogy. There's horrific cosmic evil there. That is often a part of the vision of fiction that's connected with modern science, or even advancements of modern science, even more so. So it's not unusual. But that, when it was first published, so it was a shilling in Britain, it was a penny in the US. It was brought out around the same time. When it was brought out, they only produced about 3,000 copies, not thinking it would be very popular. Then it was favorably reviewed in the Times, in the newspaper in London, and suddenly the interest just exploded. And within 6 months, 40,000 copies had sold. And then, when the public received this, the moral dimensions of it meant that it was starting to be referred to from the pulpits. And now we have 250,000 copies being sold. So it became a worldwide bestseller, more or less. But the reason it was used was, again, to address the moral issues related to the subject matter of this story. And the idea of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it's passed into the English idiom, right? Anyone who speaks of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde knows what they're talking about, even if they haven't read the book. And it's been adapted to stage and so forth, and film, and various versions of it. It's been, and it's popular to this very day. I'm surprised it hasn't arisen more often now. But I think that's what I want to say by way of preview. Let's talk about the some of the plot of the novel and the themes of the novel. Oh, and let me say something about the author himself. So Robert Louis Stevenson. Have you read him at all? Treasure Island? You heard of Treasure Island, at least? But so Scottish author, quite well known in his age, but this is his best known work, I think. And it, as I say, it is gothic in the sense that it has the elements of horror about it. Where it departs from the gothic is that the setting is no longer medieval in any way. And Mary Shelley's already to some degree departed from that in her work, although at least she includes it to some degree in the context. She talks about it's set in Switzerland, and it's he's reading alchemy and medieval science and so forth. So there's some engagement roughly with a pre-scientific era and an interest in magic and secrecy and all that sort of thing. Whereas here, the setting is in two places. It's in Edinburgh and it's in London. And it's the modern day Edinburgh and London. There's nothing medieval about either of them, other than that they're older cities, I guess. There's Edinburgh Castle overlooking the whole city, one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, and London, obviously, an ancient city itself. But that's unimportant for the purposes of the story. What is gothic about it is the connection of horror with science and science with secrecy. And when authors write about these themes, the reason they seem to think that secrecy is, and it is a potent issue in the novels, is because people know that scientists are doing things, but they don't understand what they're doing to this day. And it's partly because of the conditions of modern science, in a lab somewhere, where the conditions have to be contained, particularly if they're dealing with things like viruses. If you've ever been in a modern lab, you don't just have a lab coat on, you have equipment that will cover, particularly if it's a virus, it will be through a panel you're sticking your hands in case it breaks or something, because you'd be exposed and it would get out. But this is all sequestered away. It's not open to the public. It's done in the privacy of the lab. And there's no ethical scrutiny. The public square is not really thinking about this. And the other aspect of this is the judgment of the ethics of the scientific undertakings lags behind the actual science itself. So people do things, they do the experiment, and then after they've done the experiment, they think about it and say, what would the consequences be if this were actually to succeed? And it's only after there's a success that it seems the scientists suddenly stand back and think, maybe I ought not to have done this to begin with. But now the genie's out of the bottle and it's too late. In this case, we're not actually told, and this is part of the genius of Stevenson, I think, it's not exactly clear what's going on in the story for quite a long time, or who these figures are, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. takes a great deal of time, in fact. So there's a mysteriousness about who the two gentlemen are. There's also a mysteriousness about who Dr. Jekyll is and what he is doing. That is so objectionable because we're told right at the outset that there is a scientific objection being made by one of his closest friends, by the name of Lanyon, Dr. Lanyon. So there are two doctors, and they have a difference of a view on the ethics of what Dr. Jekyll is doing. But that's all that's said about it. It's very cursory, the mention. It doesn't go into any depth or detail, and it's not even revealed what is going on until almost 4/5 of the way through. And finally, you realize what Dr. Jekyll has been doing. Now, Lanyon knew, but nobody else knew, including the reader. So it's the mystery of that is partly what compels it. It's partly the horror, it's partly the mystery, and it's partly just the way in which the tale is told. I think Stevenson has got a gift for the language, and he has a gift for describing character as well. So the first character we meet is not Dr. Jekyll, it's not Mr. Hyde, it's Dr. Utterson, or rather Mr. Utterson, who's a lawyer, and a respectable one at that. And so this is partly the vehicle through which Stevenson draws the reader in. Utterson is a reliable narrator. He's not an omniscient narrator. He doesn't know everything about what's going on, but he is reliable in the sense that he's ethically trustworthy. We think he's a good man. And so when he's horrified, we're horrified. We trust his judgment on this being horrific. Or at least that if he finds it horrific, it is horrific. And furthermore, it's not just Utterson. Everyone is horrified, seemingly. So there's a universal horror at certain events and certain individuals. But what we are having portrayed here are not what we would call bad men. We're dealing with the upper crust of Edinburgh society. So we're dealing with lawyers and doctors, socially admired individuals, and there's an MP in the story. So we're dealing with, and remember, in Britain in this day, even in Scotland, there is a sense of hierarchy. They still have titles even. There's Sir so-and-so, and so there's a sense of rank in this. And with those social ranks is supposed to go, moral expectations go along with it. So a doctor in Scottish society has a very high social standing. Not just because of his knowledge, but because of what he does. He does it for the sake of others. He is expected to be, and here in Stevenson's rendering, it's far more explicit than most Victorian fiction will be. He's supposed to possess Christian character. It's shot throughout the novel, and Scotland of this day would be extraordinarily full of Christian sentiment. So I'll just read the beginning of it and give us a sense of the language that Stevenson uses to set the stage, and puts with titles here. Here, the first chapter is not chapter 1, it's called The Story of the Door. And he uses his titles, interestingly, to describe what's going on in the story. So here, the focus is on the door. And the door then is a portal that behind which there's hidden a mystery. So the door becomes a central motif in the whole story. What's behind the door? And there's a key that unlocks the door. And where does that door lead to? And at first it's unclear. And so there's a gradual revelation as the story progresses of things that at first are entirely mysterious. And as we get closer and closer to the center of the mystery of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we come to a rather, I think, unexpected conclusion. And that's the case for Utterson as well. Anyway, Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of a rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beaconed from his eye. Something, indeed, which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in these silent symbols of the after-dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. He was austere with himself, so no hypocrisy here. He wasn't just austere in public and self-restrained, he was austere with himself. Now, here's Stevenson's comedy, his irony. So he was austere with himself. He drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintage. So he drinks stronger alcohol to kill off the badness of drinking wine. In Scottish society, drinking is permissible for some. For others, being a teetotaler is the expectation. You don't drink if you're a Christian. It's unclear where Utterson stands in the ecclesiastical on the ecclesiastical candle here, as it were. But his austerity means that he drinks even stronger stuff when he's on his own. Is he really austere? No, not really. I think that it's intentionally tongue-in-cheek. And though he enjoyed the theater, had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. I think it's ironic. But he had an approved tolerance for others, sometimes wondering, almost with envy, at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds, and in any extremity inclined to help rather than to reprove. I incline to Cain's heresy, he used to say quaintly. I let my brother go to the devil in his own way. In this character, it was frequently, so he's not a do-gooder. He doesn't try and save the world through his actions. He lets other people do what they will, which he calls Cain's heresy. Now, there's an irony there because of Cain. Of course, Cain is not renowned for letting his brother do what he wants. He's being renowned for murdering his brother. So again, we get something of Utterson's character is here. He uses Christian language. Does he have Christian character, actually? In this character, Stevenson writes, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of down-going men. And to such as these, so long as they came into his about his chambers, he never marked a shade of change in his demeanor. No doubt the feat was easy to Mr. Utterson, for he was undemonstrative at the best, and even his friendships seemed to be founded in a similar catholicity of good nature. It was the mark of a modest man to accept his friendly circle ready-made from the hands of opportunity, and that was the lawyer's way. His friends were those of his own blood, or those whom he had known the longest. His affections, like ivy, were the growth of time. They implied no aptness in the object. Hence, no doubt, the bond that united him to Mr. Richard Enfield, his distant kinsman, the well-known man about town. It was a nut to crack for many what these two could see in each other, or what subject they could find in common. It was reported by those who encountered them in their Sunday walks that they said nothing, looked singularly dull, and would hail with obvious relief the appearance of a friend. So they would go around together every Sunday but enjoy one another's company, and yet they stuck together. So you're getting a portrait of Mr. Utterson here. And the portrait is of somebody who's not very attractive as a character. He's restrained. He's probably dull. And yet he's trustworthy. There's no duplicity here. Right? He's not a social climber. And he seems content with his life, and he doesn't want to change it. It chanced on one of these rambles that their way led them down a by street in a busy quarter of London. The inhabitants were all doing well, it seemed, and all emulously hoping to do better still, and laying out the surplus of their gains in coquetry, so that the shop fronts stood along the thoroughfare with an air of invitation, like rows of smiling saleswomen. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of passage, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighborhood, like a fire in a forest. And with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger. And so they go along. You're getting a picture of London. London at this time being a very wealthy city. When Dickens writes A Tale of Two Cities, the two cities that he talks about, the most prosperous cities of the world, are London and Paris. And London is probably the foremost of the two. By the end of the 19th century, when Stevenson writes this, it certainly is. This is the British Empire at its height. So there's the shutters on the windowsills are painted, and there's brass on the doors, and it's been polished so that it shines. So this is a very wealthy area, and people are up and coming and wanting to be even more prosperous. So that's the setting. The setting here is of a very affluent and social elite. Two doors from one corner on the left going east, the line was broken by the entry of a court, and just at that point, a certain sinister block of building thrust forward its gable on the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story, and a blind forehead of discolored wall on the upper, and bore in every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and distained. Tramps slouched into the recess and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop under the steps. The schoolboy had tried his knife on the moldings, and for close on a generation, no one had appeared to drive away these random visitors or to repair their ravages. So in the midst of all this affluence and the improvement and the pride of ownership of the whole area, we have this building which is rather decrepit and decayed and is being wrecked by the social riffraff of London. Mr. Enfield and the lawyer were on the other side of the by street, but when they came abreast of the entry, the former lifted up his cane and pointed. "Did you ever remark that door?" he asked. And when his companion had replied in the affirmative, "It's connected in my mind," added he, "with a very odd story." "Indeed," said Mr. Utterson with a slight change of voice. "And what was that?" Okay, so now we get the story. So the story of a decrepit door in the midst of progress is a metaphor for the decrepitude of what the story will tell about a man in the midst of progress. So it's a symbol of it, I think. Well, it was this way. I was going home from some place at the end of the world about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, and my way lay through a part of town where there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps. By the way, 3 o'clock in the winter in London, it's almost dark. You need to understand, London, England is much further north than where we are in Toronto in terms of latitude. The weather is more temperate because of the winds that go across the British Isles, so they don't get the same cold that we do here, but it's actually further north. And when you're in Scotland, it's further north still. Actually, in the middle of the winter at 3 o'clock, it's pitch black in Scotland, I believe, around that time at any rate. But it's already getting dark there, and so the lights are on to illumine the streets. So there's literally nothing to be seen but lamps. Street after street, and all the folks asleep. Street after street. It must be 3 o'clock in the... Oh, it is 3 o'clock in the morning. Okay, well, of course everyone's black then. It's not 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Sorry. Yes, so he's out late, and they're all lighted as if for a procession, and all as empty as a church. Till at last I got into that state of mind when a man listens, and begins to long for the sight of a policeman. All at once I saw 2 figures. One, a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, and the other, a girl of maybe 8 or 10, who was running as hard as she was able down a cross street. Well, sir, the 2 ran into one another, naturally enough, at the corner. Didn't see one another. And then came the horrible part of the thing, for the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man. It was like some damned juggernaut. I gave a few hallo, took to my heels, collared my gentleman, and brought him back to where there was already quite a group about the screaming child. He was perfectly cool and made no resistance, gave me one look, so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. The people who had turned out were the girl's own family, and pretty soon the doctor, for whom she had been sent, put in his appearance. Well, the child was not much the worse, more frightened, according to the sawbones, reference to the doctor. And there you might have supposed would have been an end to it. But there was one curious circumstance. I had taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight, so the guy he grabbed by the collar. So had the child's family, which was only natural. But the doctor's case was what struck me. He was the usual cut and dry apothecary. He mixes chemicals. That's what an apothecary does. They call it, in Britain now they call them chemists. We go to the Shoppers, the Drug Mart, or that they call them chemists in the UK, and they would mix their own medicine there. Now we have big pharmaceutical companies that produce the pills and whatever. At that time, you would have ingredients, and the chemists would make the medicine for you in the shop. So they're called the chemists here, or the apothecaries, which is an even older word. But that's who this man is. This is a man who makes medicine in his shop from chemicals. So he comes out of no particular age and color with a strong Edinburgh accent and about as emotional as a bagpipe. Well, sir, he was like the rest of us. Every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that Sawbones turned sick and white with the desire to kill him. I knew what was in his mind, just as he knew what was in mine. And killing being out of the question, we did the next best. We told the man we could and would make such a scandal out of this as should make his name stink from one end of London to the other. If he had any friends or any credit, we undertook that he should lose them. And all the time, as we were pitching it in red hot, we were keeping the women off him as best we could, for they were as wild as harpies. I never saw a circle of such hateful faces. And there was the man in the middle with a kind of black, sneering coolness. Frightened too, I could see that, but carrying it off, sir, really like Satan. If you choose to make capital out of this accident, said he, I am naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene, says he. Name your figure. Well, we screwed him up to £100 for the child's family. Now, £100 is a huge sum of money in that day. Remember, this cost a shilling. £100 would be, I have no idea how much that would be in contemporary sums, but I'd say hundreds of thousands. It's a lot of money. It's not a small sum. And he would have clearly liked to stick out. But there was something about the lot of us that meant mischief, and at last he struck. He agreed, £100. Okay. The next thing was to get the money. Where do you think he carried us? But to that place with the door. Whipped out a key, went in, and presently came back with a matter of £10 in gold and a check for the balance on coots, drawn, payable to bearer, and signed with a name that I can't mention, although it's one of the points of my story. But it was a name at least very well known and often printed. The figure was stiff, but the signature was good for more than that, if it was only genuine. And so he goes in, and they find out, in fact, that the check is not going to bounce, that it's honored. Okay, so the man is not just any man, he's a gentleman, and a gentleman of some substance, because £100 just payable there is an extraordinary sum of money. But that's how the story is introduced. Now, note from this, we already have interest drawn in the intrigue surrounding the door and the man connected with it and the sort of character he is. So very cleverly, and of course we're also introduced to the main storyteller, Utterson, who happens also to be a lawyer, and so he's a member of the legal establishment. So he's there to guard law and order, not just reputation, but make sure that the law is done. So he himself cannot be involved without being disbarred in any criminal activities. He must be above board in his own conduct. So that's how we're introduced to Utterson, is hearing this story told by his friend Enfield. Now Utterson, as it comes out, is central to the story. He's not just the storyteller, he's implicated in the events of the story. And Enfield goes on towards the end, so page 4 in this edition. Enfield goes on and says, I have studied the place for myself. It seems scarcely a house. There is no other door. So along the street, there's this splendid row of houses, and then there's this one horrible house, which is run down 2 stories, no window. There's a door in it, and the door is battered and scratched and so forth. And no one goes in and out of that one. But once in a great while, the gentleman of my adventure, he goes in there. This little horrible man that ran over the child and came up with £100 very quickly. There are 3 windows looking on the court on the first floor, none below. The windows are always shut, but they're clean. And then there is a chimney, which is generally smoking, so somebody must live there. And yet it's not so sure, for the buildings are so packed together that about the court that it's hard to say where one ends and another begins. But he never asked about the door. And Utterson approves of this fact. So this is another interesting about Utterson, is that although he's a lawyer, he's not a detective, and he doesn't want to find out what's going on. When things come to him, he will accept them. But this is not a detective novel. Utterson is not determined to get to the bottom of this. He's a lawyer, things come to him, and that's how they will come, by the way. People will send him letters, which he will have to read because it's part of his profession, but he does know we're not dealing with somebody who has a sense of morbid curiosity. And his lack of curiosity, I think, has the effect on the reader of piquing our curiosity. And also has the sense that he's not driving the plot, other events are driving the plot. But it's a good rule of yours not to involve yourself in things, and Enfield says, yes, I think it is. But for all that, continued the lawyer, there's one point I want to ask. I want to ask the name of that man who walked over the child. Well, said Mr. Enfield, I can't see what harm it would do. It was a man of the name of Hyde. Said Mr. Utterson. What sort of a man is he to see? He is not easy to describe. There's something wrong with his appearance. something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked. And yet I scarce know why. He must be deformed somewhere. He gives a strong feeling of deformity. Although I couldn't specify the point. He's an extraordinary looking man. And yet I really can name nothing out of the way. No, sir. I can make no hand of it. I can't describe him. And it's not want of memory, for I declare I can see him this moment. Mr. Utterson again walked some way in silence and obviously under a weight of consideration. You are sure he used a key? He inquired at last. My dear sir, began Enfield, surprised out of himself. Yes, I know, said Utterson. I know it must seem strange. The fact is, if I do not ask you the name of the other party, it is because I know it already. You see, Richard, your tale has gone home. If you've been inexact in any point, you had better correct it. I think you might have warned me, returned the other with a touch of sullenness, but I've been pedantically exact, as you call it. The fellow had a key, and what's more, he has it still. I saw him use it not a week ago. Mr. Utterson sighed deeply, but said never a word, and the young man presently resumed. Here's another lesson to say nothing, said he. I am ashamed of my long tongue, but let us make a bargain never to refer this again. With all my heart, said the lawyer. I'll shake hands on that. Why is he insistent on that? Because he actually knows whose house it is. And the man whose house it is his client, Dr. Jekyll. But this man doesn't sound like Dr. Jekyll. And yet he has a key, and he continues to have the key. So that's how the story begins. And there is, as chapter 2 describes it, a search for Mr. Hyde at this point. Because Mr. Hyde, being a bad man, to have done such a horrid thing to a young girl, so heartlessly, and also possessing the key to one of the more established gentlemen of the entire city, Dr. Jekyll. And we're in the second chapter introduced to him, and he has a whole variety of titles to him. So he's an MD, he's a DCL, an LLD, an FRS, etc., etc. And Mr. Utterson knows him because Jekyll is his client. And not only his client who he has written up a will for him. And he knows the contents of the will. And he goes back home and then he opens them. So that reference to a door and the key to the door makes him go back and say, okay, well, who is this? And now he starts revealing things, and the thing that he reveals leads him to a sense of horror. So let me read the will. And he does it at night in the dark. And inside the safe, in the most private part of it, there's a document endorsed on the envelope as Dr. Jekyll's will. And he sat down with a clouded brow to study its contents. The will was a holograph. For Mr. Utterson, though he took charge of it now that it was made, had refused to lend the least assistance in the making it, it provided not only that in the case of the decease of Dr. Jekyll, Dr. Henry Jekyll, all his possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor, Edward Hyde, the man who trampled the girl. But that in case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexpected absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months, the said Edward Hyde should step into the said Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay, and free from any burthen or obligation beyond the payment of a few small sums to the members of the doctor's household. So now he's horrified. Not only is the man who trampled the child connected to his client, he also sees that his client, Dr. Jekyll, has him as his the beneficiary of his will. And not only in the case that he dies, but in the case that he even disappears. And it says, this document had long been the lawyer's eyesore. It offended him, both as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life, to whom the fanciful was the immodest, and hitherto it was his ignorance of Mr. Hyde that had swelled his indignation. This is a very strange will. If he just disappears for 3 months, he gets everything. Not when he dies. When he dies, it would be odd, because how is he related? But that's up to his client. Go ahead. Okay, you can leave your estate to whomever you will. But here it's even if he disappears for 3 months, everything goes to him. And this is unusual, and as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary, he thinks it bothers him. And hitherto it was his ignorance of Mr. Hyde that had swelled his indignation. Now, by a sudden turn, it was his knowledge. It's far worse than he thought. It's not just this is a mysterious man, it's a very, very bad man. And it was already bad enough when the name was but a name of which he could learn no more. It was worse when it began to be clothed upon with detestable attributes, and out of the shifting, insubstantial mists that had so long baffled his eye, there leapt up the sudden definite presentment of a fiend. I thought it was madness, he said, as he replaced the obnoxious paper in the safe, and now I begin to fear it is disgrace. So at first he thought Dr. Jekyll was crazy. Why would you give him your estate? Now I think there's something even worse here. And so the man who doesn't really want to know what's going on is being dragged into it by virtue of his legal profession. He has to do it because he has to execute his client's will. And now he's concerned about the man whom he's legally allied to. Because, of course, even in the case of a legal document, if there's a criminal act going on that has coerced it, there's a problem for you as a lawyer. And so he wants to get in and to the bottom of what's exactly going on there. So there's a search for Mr. Hyde, and I'm going to pick it up in a little later on in the second chapter, because he soon runs into Mr. Hyde. And how does he run into him? Well, he goes and touches him on the shoulder. He sees them. He sees him on the street. He sees him on the street near the door, and he goes up to him, touches him on the shoulder, and says, "Mr. Hyde, I think." And Mr. Hyde shrank back with a hissing intake of the breath, like serpent-like. But his fear was only momentary, and though he did not look the lawyer in the face, he answered coolly enough, "That's my name. What do you want?" "I see you are going in," returned the lawyer. "I am an old friend of Dr. Jekyll's, Mr. Utterson, of Gaunt Street. You may have heard my name. In meeting you so conveniently, I thought you might admit me." "You will not find Dr. Jekyll. He's from home," replied Mr. Hyde, blowing in the key. And then suddenly, still without looking up, "How did you know me?" "On your side," said Mr. Utterson. "Will you do me a favor?" "With pleasure," replied the other. "What shall it be?" "Will you let me see your face?" asked the lawyer. Mr. Hyde appeared to hesitate, and then, as if upon some sudden reflection, fronted about with an air of defiance, and the pair stared at each other pretty fixedly for a few seconds. "Now I shall know you again," said Mr. Utterson. "It may be useful." "Yes," returned Mr. Hyde. "It is as well we have met. And apropos, you should have my address." And he gave a number of a street in Soho. "Good God," thought Mr. Utterson. "Can he, too, have been thinking of the will?" Because the will was connected with the street in Soho. But he kept his feelings to himself and only grunted in acknowledgement of the address. "And now," said the other, "how did you know me?" "By description," was the reply. "Whose description?" "We have common friends," said Mr. Utterson. "Common friends? echoed Mr. Hyde a little hoarsely. Who are they? Jekyll, for instance, said the lawyer. He never told you, cried Mr. Hyde with a flush of anger. I did not think you would have lied. Come, Mr. Utterson, that is not fitting language. Of course, he has lied. It's not, he didn't find out from Dr. Jekyll, right? Anyway, I want to read some of his reflections on this and just the language here. This is Utterson's reflection on the encounter. He said, God bless me, the man seems hardly human. Something troglodytic, shall we say? Or can it be the old story of Dr. Fell? Or is it the mere radiance of a foul soul that thus transpires through and transfigures its clay continent? The last, I think. For oh, my poor old Harry Jekyll, if ever I read Satan's signature upon a face, it is on that of your new friend. Very, very bad man. He's looked in his face and saw evil there. He goes home. More reflections. Poor Harry Jekyll, he thought, my mind misgives me. He is in deep waters. He was wild when he was young. A long while ago, to be sure. But in the law of God, there is no statute of limitations. Ah, it must be that. The ghost of some old sin, the cancer of some concealed disgrace, punishment coming pede claudo, years after memory has forgotten and self-love condoned the fault. That's how they got connected. There's some dark secret that Dr. Jekyll must have to connect him with this sordid gentleman. And 8 lines down. This Master Hyde, if he were studied, thought he, must have secrets of his own, black secrets by the look of him, secrets compared to which poor Jekyll's worst would be like sunshine. Things cannot continue as they are. It turns me cold to think of this creature stealing like a thief to Harry's bedside. Poor Harry, what awakening, and the danger of it. For if this Hyde suspects the existence of the will, he may grow impatient to inherit. So this is his concern, is that Dr. Jekyll is going to find out that, or rather Mr. Hyde is going to find out that he is the inheritor of the will, and he might do something about it because he's a bad man. So he might kill him. So now his mind is starting to run wild. He goes in to see Dr. Jekyll and finds that Dr. Jekyll is not the least troubled by all this. And then a man is murdered by the name of Carew, and Carew is an MP. He's murdered in the streets, and the murderer is Mr. Hyde. I'm skipping over a fair bit here. And then there's the incident of the letter. Let me come to that chapter. I don't know if it's chapter 5. It's on page 18 here if you've got this. The incident of the letter. So a servant sees Mr. Hyde beat Sir Danvers Carew to death. And Carew is another of Utterson's clients. So Utterson is getting dragged into this all over the place now. And the police contact him, and he leads the officers to Mr. Hyde's apartment, but Mr. Hyde's not there. But they do find the murder instrument. It's half a broken cane. And the other half was at the crime scene. So it's clear who did the murder now. Or at least it is evidence that points to it. And Utterson further recognizes that's the cane I gave to Dr. Jekyll. So it's not just any old cane. I gave that to my friend and client, Dr. Jekyll. Now Utterson, having not being able to find Mr. Hyde, goes and visits Jekyll. And he shows Utterson a note. And the note was allegedly written to Jekyll by Hyde. And it apologizes for all the trouble he's caused. And that leads, and Jekyll further says, there's not going to be a problem with this anymore. Mr. Hyde's going to go away. Look at here, he's written a letter. He said I'm not concerned about the problem. The issue with Mr. Hyde is done with. They still have a murderer out there, but at least he's not going to come back, and he's not going to be associated with Dr. Jekyll. The problem, however, which emerges at this point, is that they find out that Mr. Hyde's handwriting is very similar to Dr. Jekyll's. In fact, almost the same. And so Utterson concludes from this that Dr. Jekyll is lying to him, and he's lying to him to protect Mr. Hyde. So he's forged this letter from Mr. Hyde to cover for Mr. Hyde. So it's his friend's good character. Jekyll at this point is not in a good state, but for 2 months he returns to being something more like himself. I'm just skipping over some of the story now. Next class I'm going to talk about what Stevenson is actually teaching us through this, or the message, as it were, of the story. So he goes back to being very sociable, very Christian, I think. I think the language is even speaking something of that sort. So in the remarkable incidents of Dr. Layton, page 22, it says, now that the death of Sir Danvers was, to his way of thinking, more than paid for by the disappearance of Mr. Hyde, and now that the evil influence had been withdrawn, a new life began for Dr. Jekyll. He came out of his seclusion. So he's becoming a public man again. He renewed relations with his friends. He became once more their familiar guest and entertainer. And whilst he'd always been known for charities, he was now no less distinguished for his religion. So he suddenly became a religious man, very interested in matters religious. So a transformation has taken place in Dr. Jekyll. And it seems like Mr. Hyde's gone, and that has that sort of liberated him to be more like himself. But that doesn't last very long, and he starts refusing visitors again. And another problem arises, his friend Dr. Lanyon. Now, Dr. Lanyon is the doctor that was mentioned right at the outset of the work, with whom he has had a professional disagreement. These are two doctors, and we don't know what the substance of their disagreement is. Like, why have they fallen out, these two men? But they have fallen out, not personally. On a personal level, they are friends still, but on a professional level, they are in disagreement about something that Dr. Jekyll is doing. And we don't know what that is at this point. But Dr. Lanyon, who is a friend of, or acquaintance of Dr. Jekyll and the lawyer Utterson, dies of shock after he receives information related to Jekyll. But before his death, he's given, Dr. Lanyon gives Utterson a letter. And the letter is to be opened in the event of Dr. Jekyll's death or disappearance. Only then. So he can't open it. In late February, so 2 months later, when he's walking with Enfield, the man he was speaking to at the outset, Utterson starts a conversation with Jekyll at the window of his lab, and Jekyll slams the window and he disappears. And he secludes himself again, and he's secluded in his laboratory for weeks. And at that point, they break into the lab, and they just find that Mr. Hyde is in there. And what's he doing? He's wearing Dr. Jekyll's clothes and is apparently dead from suicide. And they also find a letter from Jekyll to Utterson. So they find another letter. So all sorts of letters, all these letters, which are only to be opened under certain circumstances. So the element of suspense is there. Well, what's in the letter? Would you read the letter? I mean, well, you can't, because he's being directed professionally. You open this only under these circumstances. And sometimes it's through swearing that he won't do it, but certainly professionally he cannot do it except under the direction of his client. So finally, Utterson reads Lanyon's letter. Why does he read it? Because Jekyll's dead. He's seen him, or Mr. Hyde is there. And then he reads Jekyll's letter. So now he's read both of them. Now Lanyon's letter reveals that the reason he had died, that is Lanyon, out of shock, was that he saw Mr. Hyde drink a serum. And the serum converted him into Dr. Jekyll. So there's the revelation. This man drank the serum that made him into this man. That's the first letter. The second letter from Dr. Jekyll explains that he had indulged in certain vices, and he was afraid of being discovered. And he found a way to transform himself and indulge his vices without being discovered. So these two opposite pictures. Jekyll took this, transformed himself, or rather Hyde took this, transformed himself into Jekyll. That's what Dr. Lanyon's letter betrayed. Dr. Jekyll's letter explained that he found a way to transform himself out of his sense of vice that will nonetheless keep his secrets. And Jekyll's transformed body, Mr. Hyde, was evil, self-indulgent, uncaring to anyone but himself. I'm going to leave it off at that and pick it up next time. And I'm then going to go through what Stevenson adds to the Gothic horror novel. Because up to this point, it's just a horrifying portrait, artfully told. But there's a lot more to the story than simply a mystery and the use of science now, because it's clear that he's been taking chemicals for himself, and the ground of disagreement between the two doctors is probably on why you would use these chemicals and for what purpose. And we'll come to that next time. Okay, so.